Earlier this summer, my fiance and I bought a house in Owatonna. Previously, I had lived in New Richland, and he had lived out in the country. We bought a house, and it was on Prospect Street. And as we were looking at the house, Shannon said to me, "I wonder what building that is just down the street." And usually know what every building is, but he didn't know, so as I was looking at the house, he drove down the street and he swung back around. He said, "Lisa, it's a Methodist church." Well, 4 years ago today, I was serving in a Methodist church. I was the pastor at the Ellendale United Methodist Church. And then some things happened in my life that I made the decision to retire from the ministry, or so I thought. So about 4 weeks ago, I finally made my way down to the Methodist church, which literally is 3 houses down from our house. I always think God works in very mysterious ways. So I made my way down to the church, and in those 4 years since I've been a pastor, I've been asked many times to do pulpit supply and to fill in, and I've always said no. Well, I went down to the Methodist church, and I went to the second service, and it was a quiet little service, and then Lauren got up and preached, and afterwards I went back and greeted Lauren, and he said, I told him a little bit about my history, and he said, "Do you want to fill in at the Dodge Center Church?" And I said, "Yes." And after I said yes, I thought, where did that come from? So that's how I ended up here today. Well, and in the meantime, my fiance and I were trying to figure out what day to get married, what would work. When it's a second marriage, you have children I have 3 children, he has 2 children. And my middle daughter was returned last night from a trip to Spain. And she lives in Iowa, and the poor thing always misses out on everything. So we said, let's get married on Sunday the 12th, which is today. So, it's a preacher's life. We preach in the morning, we may do a funeral in the afternoon and meet with a wedding couple in the evening. So this is just par for the course. And our gospel lesson today is about a wedding. And Lauren was teasing us when we met with him that maybe we should use this passage as our wedding passage. And I said, well, I think we could probably do a little better. For this passage tells about 10 bridesmaids. 5 are wise and 5 are foolish. And these 10 bridesmaids had one job to do, just one job, and that was to light the way to the wedding. So they had their lamps, they grabbed their lamps, and just as we do sometimes when we take a flashlight out of the drawer or whatever, we grab it and assume that there's enough battery in there, or in this case, there's enough oil. So they grabbed their lamps. But the 5 wise bridesmaids, you know what they thought ahead? And they thought, I'm going to grab some extra oil. The others just grabbed their lamps and scooted on out the door. Well, as it happened, and as what happens many times, grooms get delayed. And in this case, the groom got very delayed. And they fell asleep. This summer, my son and his wife had their wedding reception up in Grand Marais. And I don't know, has anybody ever been up to Grand Marais? It's on the North Shore. You go north of Duluth. It's about, I'd say, 6 or 7 hours drive from here. And about a 5-hour drive from St. Paul, where my son lives. Well, some of us had arrived earlier the day before, and my son was coming up on Friday night. So those of us that were already there, we lit a fire, and we were all sitting around, and we were waiting. And as a true fashion of grooms, he was late. And it's a little different than ancient times because his bride could talk to him on the phone and knew that he was safe, but he was late in arriving. So those of us had to keep the fire going, and we told jokes and told stories, and we just kept awake. And a few drifted off to bed, but there was a core group of us that felt that we could not make Tom arrive without somebody greeting him. And we didn't want to make Kathleen, his wife, wait alone. So even though it was tough and we'd all spent the day working around the house and getting it ready for the wedding, and we were all very tired, we kept the fire going and we stayed awake. And to be honest, when he got there, we all just pretty much got up, gave him a hug, and went to bed. But the point is that we stayed awake. We kept the lamps lit. And I get the panic that the bridesmaids who didn't have the oil felt. The foolish bridesmaids when they came to the night of questions and discovered they had no oil in their lamps and had to make a last-minute run to the corner store to replenish their supply. I can only imagine their disappointment when they returned to discover that they had missed the big event altogether. And I know what this feels like on a day-to-day basis, and I am familiar with the meaning of this in my own faith life. I know what it is to discover that the oil has run low. Who of us has not identified from time to time with the 5 foolish bridesmaids and felt as if our faith and our oil has run low? Reverend David Henson writes, "For most of my life, I have identified with the 5 wise bridesmaids, always seeking to have enough of the good stuff in my lamp, good works, good faith, to persevere in a dark and sinful world. I envisioned myself as one of the wise, holding my lamp in the dead of the night. But my sympathies changed when I spiraled into deep doubt for the first, but certainly not the last time. Suddenly I saw myself as a foolish bridesmaid watching my lamp light evaporate into thin tendrils of smoke, quite jealous of those whose faith still burned brightly. He said I was foolish, begging my lamp not to go out and to conjure more faith and light in my life than the foolish bridesmaids could conjure up their needed oil in the dead of night. My life echoes that of David's. As I said earlier, 4 years ago, I was a pastor. My lamp, my light, I felt my oil was full. My lamp was full. And then in the summer of 2012, my mother died suddenly. She had dementia, and she wasn't that old. She was in her 70s, but she had for the last 10 years been suffering from dementia. And she went into the hospital with an infection that turned septic, and then she had a heart attack. And within a week, she died. So we'd just gotten over the shock of my mother dying, and my dad had been planning a trip up to Canada, to Nova Scotia. And while we were there, and actually our family was in Grand Marais, we got a call early in the morning that my dad had died suddenly. Suddenly the oil started to dip pretty low. Within the course of mourning my parents, I realized that my marriage wasn't what I thought it was, and my ex and I divorced. By then, things were pretty low. And so I got to a point where I just felt I needed to take some time away and left the ministry. It was at that point that I felt I had no oil left in my lamp. But there was some oil. There always is oil. For 4 years is what I call my kind of wandering in the wilderness time. I was low on oil, but I did have some oil, just like the bridesmaids who ran to the corner store had some oil in their lamps. But sometimes we forget we have that oil. So during that time, those 4 years, as I look back on it, I remember times when I had people that came into my life that helped fill my lamp again. I remember a dear friend from seminary saying to me when I said, what if God doesn't know to call me back? Or what if I'm done? What if this is the end of my ministry? And he said, you don't have to worry. God knows your number. God can call you anytime he wants. You don't have to worry. Live your life, and God will call you when God's ready. I had forgotten that God calls us in God's time, not my time. And then when I met Shannon, my soon-to-be in a couple hours husband, I remember him asking me questions about the Bible and about the church, and his kids would ask me questions, and they'd say, well, what about this verse or this passage? What does that mean? And so then I would start in, kind of switch back into pastor mode. And he said to me one time, he goes, you know, when you start talking that way, your voice goes up, and you get happy. And that made me think. It is something that makes me happy. And then there's my friend Diane, who's going to be standing up for me today. I met her in a divorce support group, and I lived with her the summer between when I was done at the church and when I moved into my house. And we had been friends for many years, and we'd done things together and talked about men and all this. She's a single woman. And one day she said to me as we pulled into my driveway, she said, can I pray with you? And I didn't really want to. But I knew it took her great courage to ask if she could pray with me. And just mostly to please her, I said, well, okay. But God works through that. And God worked that day. And I felt a deep sense of peace that I had not felt in many years. And my lamp began to fill even more until I arrived here today. So what was the mistake that the foolish bridesmaids made? What did they do that made them foolish? Maybe it wasn't just that they didn't take enough oil. Maybe it was that they didn't have faith. That they could continue on with their lamps low on oil. Or that even if their lamp went out, they could trust that there would be enough light to light their way. And I know we have all had times in our life where our lamps are low and the light is going dim. And what do we do to keep that faith alive? What do we do to have enough light in our life? Jesus is saying that we need to keep our lamps lit, that we need to keep awake, and know that we have enough to keep us going until Jesus arrives again. We have his precious gift, and we just have to recognize it and believe it. I don't know if any of you have read the books by Sarah Young, Jesus. I think the one I'm reading is Jesus Always. I think the other one is God is Calling. But in her devotion the other day, as I was working on this sermon, was this. So I'd like to say it in conclusion. I provide sufficient light for only one day at a time. If you try to look into the future, you will find yourself peering into darkness. My face shines upon you only in the present. This is where you'll find my unfailing and unquenching love. Amen.